Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies in the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and Criminology at University of Minnesota Duluth. My name is Dr. Devalina Das, and I am an assistant professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Before we start today's event, we would like to thank our department head, Scott Golan, for providing departmental support in organizing this event, and thanks to Andy Stanley and Peter Angelos for providing all my colleagues in the department who have been very supportive for them. We are excited to organize this very timely and relevant transnational feminist collaborative discussion with Professor Carole Ferrier, one of the pioneering feminists of Australian women's liberation movement, who in 1970s raised several eyebrows due to her radical feminist Marxist spirit and political activism. What could be more transnational than this, as we, along with Professor Ferrier, are dwelling in two different cities and two different time zones? It is Wednesday morning in Australia. Thus, we are reliving the past and the future together. Professor Ferrier came to Brisbane in 1972 after completing degrees from London and Auckland and joined the Department of English, which is also the School of Communication and Arts at the University of Queensland. In Auckland, in the 1950s, he was one of the only handful of women academics involved in the anti-war movement, anti-racism, and gay liberation struggles, and the beginning of the women's liberation movement. In Australia, she spent all her academic life for the next decade organizing and participating in the democratic rights and indigenous rights movement. She convened women's and gender studies at University of Queensland from 1990s, was the president of the Australian Women's and Gender Association, and is a life member of the Modern Languages Association and the National Tertiary Education Union. Some of her books include Gender Politics and Fiction, As Good as a Yarn with New Letters Between Six Australian Women Writers, a Janet Crane Reader, Jane Devaney, Romantic Revolutionary, and Radical Brisbane, and Unruly History. She's the editor of the Women's Liberation Journal, History, since its inception in 1975, and the Australian Women's Book Review since 1999. Now, emeritus professor of the university, who continues to research in the area of gender, class, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. And today, Professor Ferrier will be speaking about channeling anger as a methodology for feminist cultural studies. We will have question and answer session after her talk is over. So with that, I ask all of you to welcome Professor Carole Ferrier.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here today with you, and it's a great honor, and I'm really looking forward to your responses to some of the material in what looks like a wonderful course that you're studying, and I've tried to make what I say feed into and supplement and develop some of that. So I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be some chance for questions. So I'll start saying a bit about my title. I've used the word channeling as having the meaning that the Urban Dictionary suggests, that it's a concept in spiritualism where a person allows their body to be used by the ghost of a dead person who can then talk to the others present through them. And I thought that was rather a nice way of thinking about how we could look towards recognition or recognition, if you like, of those writers who've gone before us, some still living, some not, and particularly people who forcefully expressed their anger in relation to major problems of human societies in which inequality, unequal power, and oppression operate. And that's almost all the societies in the world, of course, in various kinds of ways. So I think many of you have watched the film She's Beautiful When She's Angry, a history of the second wave women's movement. And that's pervaded by, I think, admiration for the many women it features. And they're nearly all people who are outraged by injustice and write and speak and act and organize to combat it. So thinking a bit about methodology, basically that's just finding a framework and a selection of crucial key terms in order to produce the best argument you can make for your interpretation or your analysis or your critique of the topic with which you're engaging. And there are some changes that have taken place in cultural and critical studies in universities and publishing too. There's a lot of critical discussion of a range of texts, and often across a number of genres of creative production that are used by authors. Mainly who I'm talking about in this talk is authors, artists, and writers, but there are also visual artists, musicians, play and film writers, other producers of performance art, and I do make some reference to some of those as well within the same kind of context. So feminism, as you know, has been around for a very long time. It means many things to many people, depending substantially on whether you like perhaps what you think feminism means or not. And Anne Curthoys, the feminist historian, wrote something in 1988 discussing whether the term women's liberation that was widely used by feminists at that time might be a better term. But she concluded that it was very difficult to displace feminism as the umbrella kind of term for various kinds of activities. So different currents within feminist movements in the 1960s were often identified as perhaps three main strands under a kind of umbrella of feminism, one being radical or separatist feminism, one being liberal feminism, and one being Marxist, anarchist, and socialist feminism. And there were lots of debates about tactics and strategies and what you should do on the demonstrations and so on. It's still going on today. But something those different strands had in common was the way in which the dominant social constructions of what becomes called the public and the private operated in relation to the ways in which the masculine and feminine were understood in any particular society. So the new slogan of the 1960s was very much the personal is political, and it became a very strong slogan for many decades after. There's also the concept of black feminism that foregrounds racial difference and what's been called the common fate of non-white people, men and women, in what Bell Hooks calls white supremacist societies. And Alice Walker, in a book of essays called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, employs the term womanism for black feminism and sees the two as, to some extent, relating to each other. Womanism is to feminism, as purple is to lavender. And then there are other complications to the picture of different kinds of currents of feminism as time goes on. Muslim feminism has become quite a widely noticed, visible thing, certainly from the 1980s and up until now. in relation to a range of issues, particularly sometimes the veil and the different reasons why Muslim women might wear or not wear the veil. And I have a very interesting article from some German feminists, and that's your reference to it in the bibliography, about some of the complications of interactions with the different currents of feminism in Germany. It's quite an interesting argument. Um, and then there's also Kimberly Crenshaw, who I expect you've come across, and her concept of intersectionality, the notion of an internet connection of oppressions, particularly the ones associated with race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, and possibilities of combining the struggles against them. And there's another comparatively new concept of thinking about gender oppression, concept have been coined by the Sydney sociologist and academic Bob, now Raywin Connell, and that's the patriarchal dividend. This operates within the ideological constructs of desirable masculinity and femininity in any particular culture. So Ellen Sixu, in one of the very famous works from the early days and very widely read of second wave feminism, The Laugh of the Medusa, discusses how these stereotypical constructs inflect the ways in which different emotions and feelings in relation to gender and as experienced in material bodies are understood. And she demonstrates with some charts of terms that those associated with the feminine in male-dominated societies are almost always evidently negative and pejorative, whereas those associated with masculinity are positive. So also central to second wave feminism is working with what were called interdisciplinary or cross or transdisciplinary modes of inquiry, and this allowed a lot of creative mixing of approaches and often quite new ways of thinking about how the texts work and giving an account of a term that gets used quite a bit from the 90s is the affect produced by reading those texts, and then of the effects of that. Yeah, in a fairly advanced course, now you'll know the difference between affect and effect. Affect, basically, it's a critical term and used quite substantially in accounts of responses to text. But affect is basically just something that moves you especially perhaps emotionally. So it affects you. It's affecting. If in usual speech, saying something's affecting might mean that it's upsetting, but the way it's used in critical theory is to look much more closely at different kinds of affect that might be generated by the way the texts are written or presented. And sometimes, as is often the case, feminist approaches try to come up with solutions to or ways of addressing the problems that they posed in the societies or spaces or times within which the texts they were considering were written or set. So there's that problem-solving aspiration and an interest in trying to answer questions or coming up with maybe different kinds of solutions to problems than the dominant ones, which frequently may not be working very well for even most people. And then when you're doing cultural studies, there's also the question of the aesthetic of creative texts, since it's relevant to their affect. how do the writers make their texts both beautiful and powerfully affecting? I think it's a wonderful comment by Toni Morrison, the black novelist, who you're probably very familiar with, I'm sure. I'm not interested in indulging myself in some private, closed exercise of my imagination that fulfills only the obligation of my personal dreams, which is to say, yes, the work must be political. The problem comes when you find harangue passing off as art. It seems to me the best art is political, and you ought to be able to make it unquestionably political and irrevocably beautiful at the same time. And I think that's a terrific aspiration for a writer to have about the aesthetic of their work, the beauty of it, but also to be insisting that the social effects of text also come into the picture. Oh, the topic I picked, anger, a very topical topic currently in a number of parts of the West, and certainly in your country and in my country. But anger was also central to the tone and the content of much of the literature and art that was produced during early second wave Western feminism and some feminisms elsewhere as well. And that anger has persisted periodically into the present. And there's also the powerful and the maddening notion of the monstrous feminine, embodied long ago in the figure of the rape survivor Medusa, with her snaky hair and a gaze that turned into stone. So the alternative terms for describing the emotion of anger, rage, ire, wrath, you can come up with a lot of synonyms for anger as a noun. And then there are probably more for anger as a verb. But I'm suggesting that they're all loaded really in relation to gender within patriarchy because of gender oppression and inequality. So things like rage, wrath, like anger, seem to be troublemaking words. And so accordingly, unfeminine emotions for women within a patriarchal society or a patriarchal family. Now, of course, some feminists are not bothered about that. They're happy to say, I'm presenting a challenge to your notions of desirable femininity or indeed to notions of desirable masculinity. Now, Sarai Chamali, who wrote a book called Rage Becomes Her, came out very recently, The Power of Women's Anger, discusses a number of historical conjunctures, particular situations when the rage of the oppressed seems to have exploded. And she says every form of justice seeking involves feminism. We just never hear about it. We don't educate children in the history of women's rights or how they intersect with civil rights, social justice, workers' rights, or environmental rights. I don't think she's talking about gender studies students, but certainly it's not a general phenomenon that goes on across universities and schools. So Chamali argues that the turn of the 18th century temperance movement was really a fight to stop domestic violence. It wasn't about puritanical women wanting to stop men consuming alcohol. It was because men would drink and bludgeon their wives and children, spend all the family's money on alcohol as well. But she says you couldn't be a woman who was angry about it because that was a privacy issue and a patriarchal right around the early 20th century. But you could get angry about the social cost of drunkenness. So she's talking about different tactics that can be used. But also the book stems very centrally from the number of issues to do with violence, inequality, and so on for women that fuel a lot of the campaigns. So just looking at a few key artists and writers, I think a number of you have seen the film about Frida Kahlo, the Mexican painter. She was crippled, as you'll know if you've seen the film, in a tram accident, a horrible tram accident in 1925. And she married Diego Rivera. She was an artist, and she married Diego Rivera, a very famous painter of large socialist murals, uh, not just in Mexico, but in the States and elsewhere. Although one he did was painted over because he insisted on putting Lenin into it. Um, anyway, Frida married Diego in 1929, and they participated in left politics of the time. In 1937, Diego arranged asylum in Mexico for Trotsky and his wife when the Stalinists were out after him, and he did end up um, murdered, actually not long after that. Carmen's art is very interesting, almost entirely self-portraits, often in a surrealist style. And you find an interesting masculinist tone to what might seem to be approval from the French theorist André Breton and art critic André Breton. There's no art more exclusively feminine in the sense that in order to be as seductive as possible, it is only too willing to play alternatively at being absolutely pure and absolutely pernicious. So this is the witch and the poor woman stereotype that you find in dominant assumptions about femininity. And he says the art of Frida Kahlo is a ribbon about a bomb. So I think that's a rather interesting comment about the force of feeling and rage and anguish and passion that Frida was animated by. Simone de Beauvoir, another very significant figure, who wrote philosophy, she wrote fiction, uh, she wrote political tracts, and she wrote a very long series of biographical volumes towards the end of her life. And she said something very interesting in 1949. Are there even women? It is hard to know any longer if women still exist, if they will always exist, if they should be women at all, what place they hold in this world, what place they should hold. And then things changed a bit because in the early 1970s, Beauvoir joined the women's liberation movement in France, especially campaigning for abortion rights. And identity politics at that stage, while they might be things that an individual writer doesn't want to be necessarily identified with, does every Mexican writer want to be compared with all the other Mexican writers or whatever? And this is something positive to praise their writing. But identity politics were often, all through this period, a good basis around which to build solidarity around progressive reforms. And with her partner Jean-Paul Sartre, she'd also given considerable support to the anti-colonial struggle in Algeria in the 1950s that led to independence in 1962. And after that, they got quite heavily involved in the anti-Vietnam War struggles that animated a lot of the Anglophone world at that stage as well. Then there's Doris Lessing in 1962 publishing The Golden Notebook, again articulating the struggles of an angry woman and artist living in London in the 1950s, recalling her earlier life in a very racist Rhodesia. The novel was read by many in the 60s as being a text about what was called then the sex wars. But Lessing herself was centrally concerned about environmental destruction, nuclear weapons, human survival, and even said in a new preface to The Golden Notebook that she wrote in 1971, the whole world is being shaken into a new pattern by the cataclysms we are living through. Probably by the time we are through, if we do get through it all, the aims of women's liberation will look very small and quaint. And then there are a number of other important figures, many, and they're all very much helped by the emergence of a boom in feminist publishing that takes off in the 1970s and lasts certainly to around the turn of the century, and then continues for some types of women's writing or migrant writing, more diverse forms of writing. So you've got Maxine Conkinston in 1976, writing about Chinese Americans, Inborn Warrior, Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts, and then not two writers I'm particularly interested in are two women born in Nigeria, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who travels between Nigeria and the United States, and Helen Oyemi, who came to Britain from Nigeria when she was 4 and began to publish there, but now lives in Prague. But one of the really interesting things about those two women's fiction is that it's very powerful writing about protective patriarchal fathers and the ways within the African family that protective power plays out to disempower the women often. So she in 2014 also published a book called We Should Be Feminists, and that was distributed to all Swedish secondary school girls. Then another of my favorite writers, you might say another of the enraged, if you like, writers of fiction, is the Australian Indigenous novelist Alexis Wright. Her best book, I think, is this one book that came out in 2015. And one of the other things that's an interesting feature, and it perhaps relates a bit to the question of aesthetics as well, is irony. If you're writing about anger, as I'm saying, many of these writers, I'm doing a very quick run through of, but frequently they use irony, and that's as a way of disarming perhaps the audience. If someone's angry and makes a speech, a demonstration, people are perhaps carried along. But sometimes on the page, maybe you need to use other kinds of devices to keep the student or the reader or the critic with you, and not sound as if you're substituting a harangue for careful and beautifully written literature. So I'm suggesting that one of the key things about Wright is her anger about racism, as well as genocide, discrimination, and planetary destruction. But that's mediated or transmuted by a fairly pervasive irony that intensifies its effect. Now, I think you've also been reading some poetry by Sylvia Plath and probably watched the film Sylvia, and very many of Plath's later poems, including some I mentioned here, all published in Ariel in 1961, express rage about the sexual politics of the 1950s. And in particular, it's something that you find with a number of these writers, especially the ones who are in couples with other famous artists. Usually the men are assumed to be freer, to have various kinds of, it's supposed to be the liberated 60s as well, around then. But the men are much freer than the women, or the women are tied down with children or whatever. So there's quite a lot of anger about the sexual politics. And also it gets played out as a hostility to Ted Hughes, who treated Sylvia Plath badly, her husband, and even perhaps drove her to killing herself. So there's a couple of, there are many, but a couple of poems responding to Plath's work and life include Robin Morgan's poem called Arraignment and Dan Wachowski's poem, The Water Element Song for Sylvia. And Arraignment's a very interesting poem because Robin Morgan was sued for it. It begins, how can I accuse Ted Hughes of the murder of Sylvia Plath? And it goes on in that kind of a vein. So you get various different editions of the Monster book. But Robin Morgan also extends this very much to almost all the relationships in the 60s and the 70s. In the title poem of her book Monster, evoking a sense of desperation in her home with two men, albeit they're sympathetic and supportive. Used to be a term for very supportive men. But she's feeling absolutely desperate, and she also has a young male child as well. And these are things that Sylvia Plath was experiencing too, as her relationship with Ted Hughes broke down, and he was running off with other women. Morgan's poem, part of it, Monster, Sweet Revolution, how I wish these female tears rolling silently down my face this second were each a bullet, each word I write, each character on my typewriter bullets, to kill whatever it is in men that built these empires, colonized my very body, then named the colony Monster. So you can see, and this is fairly typical of quite a lot of the poetry from the 60s and the early 1970s. I may be giving you a few American poets. Of course, there's a huge wealth of material elsewhere. Adrian Rich, who you might also come across, published The Phenomenology of Anger in 1973. The only real love I had ever felt was for children and other women. Everything else was lust, pity, self-hatred, pity, lust. This is a woman's confession. Now, look again at the face of Botticelli's Venus, Kylie, the Judith Chart, with her so-called smile. And then Dan Wachowski's poem, The Water Element Song for Sylvia, again coming out in 1973, and expressing something that's part of a lot of the debates about feminism going on then and extending until now, not wanting to appear to be a victim, asking for pity. This is a long poem, like the others, and you've only got a bit in the slides. And she's addressing Sylvia Plath, who's dead. Sylvia, I won't go the way you did. I won't die for love, poetry, truth, or a man who betrays me. My grandparents were potato farmers, and I have a bit of the simple potato in me. I have been a tree in winter, and I did not scream when the birds flew out of my hair. So, winding up, I have some questions. Rebecca Solnit, who you've probably come across for her coining of the term mansplaining. Men explain things to me. This is one of the books that Rebecca Solnit's published. She wrote an article addressing Christine Blasey Ford just after she appeared at the Senate in Washington last month. And she talks about, and this has been much in the news and discussion, talks about how Anita Hill didn't manage to prevent Clarence Thomas from being appointed. But it made a difference. It made a shift. It set a precedent for other things that could happen. And she talks about a punctuated equilibrium that she says is a geological term that proposes that the Earth evolves, not steadily, but with long, uneventful intervals, ruptured by epochal change. And feminism too, she says, has had its punctuated equilibrium, and the response to the Anita Hill hearing in 1991 and to many other events in recent years have been ruptures that change the social landscape. And she says to Ford, you are yourself a welcome earthquake. So it's only been a fairly brief, I suppose, set of almost something like a patchwork here. Squares perhaps cut from text with sometimes intricate patterns for making a quilt, sewn together into a quilt that I hope has conveyed some of my enthusiasm and appreciation for the politics and the beauty of angry feminist critical and creative production, and suggests that the work of ghosts from the past, going back to the channeling, although still very much alive and with us, is still ongoing and positive and a source of strength and inspiration. So I'll stop there and see if you'd like to ask anything, David.
We now open the floor for questions. Please feel free to ask questions to Carole Ferrier. You don't have to speak to any movie particularly, but you can ask questions in general, anything related to the topic. Um, we just have to make sure that she is here. You have to be a little from the back.
We're getting quite a bit of distortion coming over this sea or wherever sounds coming from. I can hear that very clearly.
We'll adjust the volume and see if that helps. Yeah. Okay. If somebody wants to try a question, yeah, just try with a question and then.
Maybe, Debbie, could you repeat things into the microphone? Would that help?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So I will start with a question, which is reading the faces. I'm thinking they are going to come up with questions. So I will start with a question, Carole. Um, my question is more general about how would you like to address the young generation, the new generation, to suggest that how can someone use anger as a kind of a methodology, especially you talked about private versus public, and we are having women's march movement across the globe. The Me Too is all about social media. We are unable to hold back our anger because of the series of oppression, because of the series of abuses that are going on. But at the same time, sometimes there are allegations that this anger is a kind of challenging men, trying to put them into oppression, and men are now oppressed. So how would you like to address this issue to the young generations? That how do they analyze anger as a methodology, as a strategy, especially in a public space?
Mm-hmm. That's a huge question, but it may be one that if some of you in the audience involved in perhaps some sort of action around feminist or other kinds of questions, I suppose the question of what kind of strategies are best to use comes up a lot. But I suppose one of the things I'd say about angry feminists is that they're breaking through that facade of respectability that was really strong in the 1950s, and it really intimidated, particularly women, from being really politically active. So you've got Betty Friedan publishing a book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963, where she talks about the mythological happiness for women in the home with the husband, the car in the drive, and the 2.2 children. You've got everything to make you happy. But the way in which the nuclear family operates produces all sorts of bad emotions, various kinds of feelings, various kinds of competition of people with each other. So I guess there are a lot more opportunities with things like social media. Let people know there's going to be a big angry demonstration, perhaps. And I remember when some of the demonstrations that were up on the film was called Anger Becomes You or something like that. I think the film at the beginning, that's the history. There's a lot of excitement about how many people are getting along to the huge demonstrations in the sense of being able to resist or fight back, and really impressive things as well. Like I remember at one point, I think it's in the film, a very young woman who's about 9 or 10 speaking to the massive rally, and that's something that's happening quite a bit again, and that's I think really quite exciting that much younger women are actually being drawn into political involvement. Maybe it happens particularly if your parents or your close friends are excited about being involved in various campaigns. But there's also some debate about lowering the voting age in Australia and some other places, and that's quite interesting because you might think, well, that could be really good, but you probably need to include more in the school education, an understanding of how that whole process works and what you can't do within kind of capitalism or government institutions. So I don't know if you were asking really how hopeful, is that one of the things in your question, how hopeful do I think we can be about where all this is going? And I think there's been a really big increase in the involvement of a lot of previously powerful people, particularly in the United States. But then the other stuff you read is all about the thousands taken off the voting rolls through just policing who's officially enrolled. So the people who've got cars to drive around and fix everything more likely to be more organised. But I think you could say that also there's a kind of sense of anger being necessary, and it's not something that's going to make you unattractive and nobody at work or at home or whoever is going to like you. So yeah, does anyone else want to come in on that one?
Yep. Yes, Ben.
You haven't got a hand mic, Debbie, have you? Because I can't hear.
Yeah. Come in the front. Yeah.
Okay. With communication being different and how we conduct it, with it being a lot more instantaneous, do you see us being able to have a dialogue as far as like feminism, the feminist movement that shows the passion of feminism without having the connotation of anger.
Yeah, but I think that's something that Alice Walker was talking about, really, and a number of the other Black women in America, and also in Australia, the people who were land rights in the Aboriginal movement kept saying white women and non-white women don't have the same lives. They don't have the same subtle discrimination, the kinds of barriers in their way, and so on. And that needs to be recognized. I think that broken down perhaps when you get big struggles going on, and particularly things to do with the far right and quite savage attacks on people that really need to be responded to with an anger. So it's also bound up with how far you see the need to have an economic base to questions of ideas of stereotypes of the masculine and the feminine, or what a desired way for men and women to behave. So yeah, I think I think there are more men in a place like the United States, more to some extent, but not substantially, in places like Britain or Australia, that are making common cause with people who are organising about, intersectionally with lots of different kinds of issues. So I think there's some hope there, but it's all being stirred up at the same time, as it is in Australia as well, with people stirring up. You might have heard there's a rather ghastly woman on the alt-right party called One Nation, a very tiny party, it's hardly looking in it, who actually managed to call the Parliament yesterday to vote for a motion that said everyone agreed with it's okay to be white. And it was absolutely extraordinary because all the conservative politicians, even though we know that's a loaded term that's associated with very conservative, even racist people, all the conservative politicians just all raced into the voting chamber and all voted for it. And then when they realised what they'd done and they looked terrible, they tried to resubmit it to a new vote. So these things make parliaments look absolutely ridiculous as well. And where's the power? If that's what a vote means, and you find nobody's looked at what they're voting for, and then they've all voted for an alt-right slogan. Yeah, yeah. So what do other people there think about? The ways in which people are working together. Is it improving? It seems to me from outside that's one of the good things about the ghastly turmoils. And we have some, but not nearly as ghastly as
Okay, more questions.
these days. Yeah.
Couple of more questions, maybe we can say. Yes, Olivia. You can tell in French right now. Yeah. Okay, this is kind of related to his question too, but how do we prevent our anger, our passion, our emotions from discrediting the feminist argument when having discussions with our peers or other people about feminist issues?
That one didn't come through. Could you repeat?
Yeah, I think that needs repeating. I'm sorry, I just got some words. It's very distorting, the sound that's coming through. I hope I haven't been distorting the time I've been talking to you.
Yeah. Okay.
how do we prevent our anger or passions from discrediting our feminist arguments when discussing feminist issues with other people?
Yeah, all right. Yeah. Well, I suppose you could say lots of feminists don't necessarily think that women or feminists are supposed to be respectable, and maybe all those stereotypes about women, you know, caring, nurturing, loving, helping, which you know, a lot of feminist theorists have pointed out, say, in the workplace, means that if you are going on like, if you like, what's a more stereotypical female person, um, yeah, you're quite often going to be pushed around, and you're not going to get promoted, and you know, you're going to get lower wages. So I think maybe there's more acceptance in things like work, particularly of women being really more assertive about their rights, and other people too, who are oppressed or exploited. Um, so, do you have a strong feeling that there are people around who disapprove of feminists who, you know, maybe go on the TV and make quite a strong statement or something, that there's a kind of cloud of disapproval is going to kind of descend on you, right?
Any other questions? Yes. Come here. Yeah, no, you can ask one.
Okay. So the quote from Simone de Beauvoir, for the even women, it is hard to know any longer if women still exist, if they will always exist, if there should be women at all, what place they hold in this world, what place they should hold. This quote was in 1949, and I feel like it is still applicable today to our society. And I just kind of wanted you to develop more on that quote and how you would compare and contrast what this meant in 1949 and what this means today in 2018.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting quotation, and it's there's a much better translation of the second sex, which is where it comes from, come out recently than the old one, which had a whole lot of missing sections and translations. But I think in a way it's kind of quite. But you could say, I suppose, well, Simone de Beauvoir, philosopher, she's a trained philosopher. She's in Sorbonne, you know, in these philosophy classes, and she's writing books and things with Jean-Paul Sartre, and the two of them are near the top of their philosophy year. So is she just kind of pursuing an abstract philosophical proposition? What do we mean by a woman? And what's the reason why a woman should continue to be and I suppose philosophers often think they're doing their work by raising those kinds of impossible questions. If you make people think, for some philosophers, then that's a lot of the point, but you don't necessarily have to have an answer. But I think it's I think when she says, "Are there even women?" Or in the partially translation, it was, "Are there women really?" So it's actually a very interesting question. What makes you think you're a woman? What makes you want to be a woman? And what are the advantages to it, or actually a lot of disadvantages to it? So what might happen in the future? As we can say, since Beauvoir was writing that, I don't think French women even had the vote until the 1950s, or they're one of the last places where women got the vote, France. But you haven't got women very prominent in a lot of jobs in France, or perhaps even in other Anglophone, Francophone countries. So what place do they hold in this world? What place should they hold? And of course, you find in the 20th and early 21st century some very striking the parliaments in Scandinavia, all run by women, and some effective and successful women political leaders like Angela Merkel and quite a lot of other very visible women around European and in some cases American and Australian parliaments and so on. So if it's to do with who's visible in supposedly running the country, or who's winning prizes for being the most exciting writer, or however you would measure things that meant it was okay to be a woman, or more it used to be. I suppose you could come up with those kinds of answers, but of course also sometimes they can be pushed back again. So you might say with something like the Supreme Court, that long time kind of understanding that there'd be a balance, and possibly a balance of female and male as well. It can just be overturned if someone's if it's merely a convention. So I suppose that raises things about strategies for advancement, and also raises things about are women fighting alone, or should they be fighting as well in this intersectional way that brings everybody together? Of course, everyone has not got the same explanation why societies are not progressive or backward or masculinist or whatever. There are different explanations that, or even opinions on whether you want to tolerate it, whether you think it spoils human relationships to have that kind of inequality.
Okay, Carol, I'll take one more question maybe from the audience. Yes. It would be helpful for her and for all of us. Thank you.
So people are asking about like emotion, how does that hinder the movement? But just wondering, like, should emotion and passion be the like force of the movement? Because like women get a lot of stuff for being passionate and emotional, but if we want to be equal, shouldn't it be at our rawest form?
Yeah. I think, yeah. Oh.
Carol, you belong to the.
I heard the question, Debbie, but I can't hear you.
Did you hear the question?
I heard the question, yes, but I couldn't hear you speaking.
I'm just adding one line to that question, that you being one of the pioneer feminists in 60s and 70s when women's liberation started, we saw how women were angry that they burned their degrees at that time. I am curious to know in continuation of that question, because you referred to Brett Kavanaugh, Brett Kavanaugh's expression was seen as very masculine, anger being masculine. And, if a woman expresses anger, it is not seen as a kind of a positive thing. So, in continuation, and we recently had Serena Williams, expressing her anger. So, I want to ask you that question, like, would you also like to look at gendering of anger, and where do we talk about this gendering of anger with the trans movement, with the LGBTQ movement?
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. But I suppose it's an argument that comes out of the history of the ways in which the women's movement and other movements have developed, and there've been huge huge victories. I know when I was here, when I was first um, my job as a lecturer when I came in the 70s, there were men at the Teachers College who would actually get thrown out and even potentially charged for being visibly homosexual. So, and I think in Tasmania, it's different in all the different states. I think in Tasmania it was even worse. But and called Dr. Duncan, who might have been drowned by somebody. Yeah. So if you think of gay marriage, I don't necessarily know if I think anyone should get married. But if you think of gay marriage going through a fairly conservative parliament as it did in Australia and in some other places, I suppose you can say that that there are these advances being made, and they make quite a big difference to how strong people feel, how far they can cope with criticism or people saying, "Oh, why are you so angry? You won't get a boyfriend, if you're always answering back and wanting to criticize and all these kinds of things that women encounter." And there's lots of studies of girls in school, I think, that suggest that girls in primary schools in various countries aren't necessarily feeling more confident about the types of aspirations they could have than they used to. Although maybe they didn't do studies about that long ago. But yeah, I suppose I think you could say that a lot of the writing that's like the literary writing for the poetry and the fiction that really makes you affected. You experience a really strong affect from that kind of writing. I think that's when it comes from a really strongly held conviction that everyone should be working hard and organizing and trying to change things in societies like this. And of course, there's the pressing issue of climate change that intersects with some of the other issues. So, yes, what do you think about that, Debbie? Your question.
Yeah, it was the same part of the question that why do we need to gender anger as masculine or feminine, and seeing from the intersectional race, age, like what was the quote? It says like the more women grow older, they become more radical. So I'm seeing like it is always added with various categories, age, race. Do we need to put all those categories? Why don't we all have the right to be angry? Why anger is a subject of privilege? Perhaps that would be a continuation of that question.
Mm. But I think also there's a timidity because you've got a shift to more conservative thinking in quite a lot of countries around the world. I think you can also observe that a timidity about people standing out as people who strongly support maybe the same kinds of things that they did 5 or 10 years ago, when those ideas seem sometimes less popular. And you don't necessarily want to stick out in what's a more hostile environment. I think that's a really, really major thing that's going on, but I think it comes into so then that not worrying about whether you look respectable or not, I think that was quite a big battle for historically, for women getting involved in politics and going out on the streets and marching and getting arrested and so on. once you've done it, it's okay. You know, you think, oh, that wasn't too bad. But I know some people who didn't want to get arrested because their relations would be furious or whatever. You know, it would be terribly disreputable and a problem. And yeah. So,
One last question before we end the session. Thank you so much, Carole. We are really, really very honored to have your talk, and thank you for getting up so early in the morning in Australia. And I hope our students are very, very interested to contact you and get in touch with you and ask further questions if they need. So thank you so much, and thanks to Paul for organizing everything.
yes,
No
yes.
problem.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to say goodbye? All right. We're done on our end. Thank you so much.
Yes, well, thanks for all your help, Andrea.